Islam. My name is Wahid Burshan, and I'll be your host for tonight's program. We have with us here Professor Jeffrey Lang. Dr. Lang is a professor of math at the University of Kansas. He has been a Muslim since 1982, and he has been active in introducing Islam to non-Muslims for many years. Before we start tonight's program, we would like to congratulate all Muslims for the coming of the month of Ramadan. During this month, Muslims first fast for 30 days from dawn to sunset. This means that they don't eat or drink or even smoke cigarettes for this period of time. Dr. Lang will speak for about 30 minutes, and he will have questions from our viewers. Please prepare your questions, and please call in. Thank you. Doctor?
Well, primarily a Muslim is supposed to dedicate really all of his efforts, however insignificant, to God. But if I may, I would like to at least secondarily dedicate this effort to my two children, my two daughters, Jamila and Sarah. When I first became a Muslim, I was bubbling with excitement about my newfound faith, like most people that convert to almost any religion. I was filled with a great sense of power and joy and peace that I had never experienced before. And so I decided to celebrate my newfound faith with people that I knew would understand. And so I decided to venture to the mosque or the masjid, the place where Muslims gather to pray. I thought I would venture there for my first time. And so I prepared myself meticulously. I made sure I looked right, that I had rehearsed the prayers carefully. I had paid great attention to every single detail, make sure I was just right. I was so excited about going. And on my way to the Islamic center in my community, I thought of how many times I had gone to the church and had never really experienced such a feeling. And this one time when I'm going to the place where Muslims pray, I'm filled with this anticipation and a little bit of apprehension, because it was a new experience for me. When I got to the Islamic center and walked in the mosque, single-room mosque, I received a strange reaction. The congregation at first looked at me with just quickly glanced at me and glanced away, and they seemed to me to be obviously uncomfortable with my being there. So I made my way towards the back of the room so that I wouldn't really stand out in the front and make people feel uncomfortable. As the congregation continued to filter in, I noticed that all of the congregation consisted of men. And I also noticed that as they came in, they would shake each other's hands and embrace each other and tell jokes and laugh and discuss politics. But while I sat in the back, no one seemed to really notice I was there. Or if they did, they quickly made an effort not to notice me. They sort of glanced and looked away, and I felt as if I had some sort of disease or something. In any case, we quickly prayed. The prayer only lasts 4 or 5 minutes, and the congregation began to leave. And on my way out, I tried to make eye contact with somebody on my way out, just so that I could get a conversation going and break the ice. But it didn't happen. But I still felt that I should go back another time or two, just so that I could break the ice, and maybe being a stranger in a very tight community, that was the reason why that happened. And so I returned a time again and a time after that, but each time the experience was almost exactly the same. And so I finally decided never to go back again. Now, this experience I've just told you about was not mine at all. It was my experience on entering the Muslim community. It was almost a 180-degree turn on the one I just described. But this is an experience of a good friend of mine, a Muslim lady in California, who converted when she was near 50 years old. She was divorced for many years, has 2 Christian children, became a Muslim because she was thoroughly convinced that the Quran was the Word of God and that she had to follow it. But the essential question is, was this woman's experience necessary from a religious standpoint, from the standpoint of faith? That's sort of the type of question I'm raising today. So keep that in mind as I go through today's discussion, today's lecture. Among the last words on the Prophet Muhammad's lips, may God's peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad's lips, was that in his farewell pilgrimage, he told his congregation, a huge congregation, that among the things they had to be very careful to do was to protect the rights of women, as well as men. And many people today are asking how well we as a community have heeded that command. Islam insists on unifying man's temporal and spiritual lives. So therefore it is and always has been a culture-producing force, perhaps more so than any other religion. Thus it should come as no surprise that non-Muslims as well as Muslims have often identified various Muslim cultures with the religion Islam itself. But this, I feel, is a mistake. For one cannot equate God's will with a man's or man's interpretation and understanding of it. Islam professes itself to be a guidance to men and women for all times and places, transcending historical and racial boundaries. If this is indeed the case, and almost every Muslim will swear that it is, then Islam could never be a call to return to the past or to simply duplicate cultural forms that are centuries old. The Muslim is fully confident that as long as he remains within the very broad guidelines of the Quran and the Prophet's explicit commands concerning it, he is completely free to exercise his God-given gift of rational thought to adapt to life's ever-changing challenges and problems. In the lifetime of Muhammad, may God bless him, he was about to send one of his companions to assume the governorship of Yemen. And so he asked him, "How will you judge on matters?" And the companion replied, "I will judge by the Quran." And then the Prophet asked, "Well, if you cannot find the matter in the Quran?" And his companion again replied, "Then I'll judge by your," and the Arabic word he used was sunnah, "I'll judge by your way, your example." And the Prophet said, "Then if you can't find the matter there?" And then he said, "Then I will use my rational judgment, my rational thought." The companion replied. And the Prophet then praised him and commended him and was pleased with him and sent him on his task of assuming the governorship. This is exactly the way Muslims are to attack life's problems. They consult the Quran, the life example of the Prophet, and then they use their God-given gift of rational thought to attack life's daily problems and adapt to life's constant changes. Keeping this in mind, the purpose of this lecture is to begin to discuss the prospects for Muslim communities of today and in the future in terms of male and female relations, at times giving special attention, that's why I'm the speaker, at times giving special attention to the situation of Muslims living in the Western nations. In the process, I will attempt to avoid discussing any particular culture's application or misapplication of the message of the Quran, however you feel about it, or for that matter, any particular scholar's opinion, however great a figure he or she was. Because human endeavor is always subject to limitation, and so I will refer, for the most part, only to the Quran and the life example of the Prophet. Also, I will avoid a long discussion, as is often the case in these type of lectures, concerning the state of women in Christian, Jewish, Persian, and Roman communities at the time of this revelation, the revelation of the Quran. Let me just say, we of the West know only too well that women have struggled a very long way, often painfully, since those times, and our societies may have some way to go yet. But I will draw parallels with other cultures when I'm talking about Islam, but only when an obvious one exists, an immediate and obvious one exists. Today's historians and cultural anthropologists agree that for the 7th century, and I underline the word today, agree that for the 7th century at least, the message of Islam was extremely progressive, and that many rights guaranteed Muslim women by Islam have been lost through centuries of pre-Islamic and foreign cultural invasion. Two good references on this are Women in Contemporary Muslim Society by Jane I. Smith, get that in most libraries, and Middle Eastern Muslim Women Speak by Fernea and Berzagan. In terms of Islam's position on the equality of men and women, the Arabian Peninsula was perhaps the ideal location for the birthplace of this message 14 centuries ago. For Arab women in Muhammad's Arabia, even before Islam, were relatively liberated, especially compared to the cultures around them. Men and women both, in pre-Islamic Arabia, were able to propose marriage. Both were able to divorce, to own property, and participate in battle. And both men and women often took part in the politics of their day. But many of these privileges depended on a tribe and social position. So it was not, these privileges were not universal. But these rights and many more were extended to all men and women and crystallized into law by the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet. Oftentimes I'm asked, exactly what is the position of the Quran on the role of women? And the question always baffles me because it's very difficult to differentiate between male and female roles based only on the Quran, or solely on the Quran. Verses like the following, rather, are typical in the Quran, in which they address men and women equally. Consider the following verse. It says, "Lo, men who surrender themselves to God, and women who surrender, and men who believe, and women who believe, and men who obey, and women who obey God, and men who speak the truth, and women who speak the truth, and men who are humble, and women who are humble, and men who give in charity, and women who give in charity." Notice it's just saying that exactly the same requirements are necessary for men and women, same privileges and requirements. "And men who fast, and women who fast, and men who guard their modesty, and women who guard their modesty, and men who remember God much, and women who remember, God has prepared for them forgiveness and a vast reward." That verse makes it perfectly clear for anyone that may have doubted it that Islam believes, or the Quran tells us, that men and women are spiritually equal and that they have the same duties and responsibilities and reward awaiting them in the hereafter if they do their best to live by God's will. Note that this verse states that heaven awaits both sexes, heaven as we come to think of it in the States. I mention this because a century just before this, church conferences were being held in Rome to decide if women were human beings or if they possessed a soul. So this just shows you that Islam really was, at least this message was ahead of its time. Almost always when the Quran does order men to act in a certain way, it explicitly calls on women to do the same, sometimes with slight modifications because of obvious differences. But more often than not, the Quran simply addresses all believers with the words, "O you who believe," in this message and in God. Some examples of the former, where the Quran addresses men in one way and then addresses women in a similar way, acknowledging slight differences. Let me begin with one. In the 24th surah, or chapter in the Quran, that's a rough translation, in the 30th verse it says, "And tell the believing men to lower something of their gaze and guard their chastity. This will be purer for them, for God is aware of the things they work." And in the very next verse it says, "And tell the believing women that they lower something of their gaze and guard their private parts," and goes on from there. The interesting thing I found about this verse when I first read through the Quran, when I was first considering Islam, is that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, interpreted this verse, what does he mean by lowering something of your gaze and to guard your chastity? The lowering of something of your gaze refers to the fact that you should not take the other sex as a sex object, to regard them only as objects of lust. What I found interesting, being a person from the West, about this verse, that the two verses combined tell you that both men and women have a tendency to take the opposite sex as an object of lust, to look at the opposite sex in a lustful way, to sometimes consider the opposite sex as sex objects. Now that may not seem striking in light of today's ideas, but you have to remember that through many periods in Western history, women were not considered to have any sexual desire at all. They were considered to be asexual throughout many long periods of our history. Even when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Connecticut in courses on psychology and sociology, this issue of whether men and women had equal or similar sexual desires was being addressed. But this verse makes it perfectly clear that men and women both have a tendency to lust for each other and to look at each other in a sexual way. Even in terms of some of the Prophet's sayings on this issue, he said one time to his community, referring to the men, he said, "Your wives have a right over you. Your wives have a right over you." And he was addressing the issue of sexual rights and sexual privileges. And on this issue he said, "Your wives have a right over you." And it's well known that most Western commentators, when they comment on Islam, they oftentimes say that the men have these rights, sexual rights over women. They very seldom also refer to the fact that in Islam, women have sexual rights over men. In another verse, in the 4th chapter of the Quran, the 34th verse, it says, "And if you fear rebellion on the part of your wives," and then it tells men to go on and how to deal with that situation. The rebellion being referred to is in terms of, suppose your spouse is about to commit a serious crime, a very serious crime. How do you go about dealing with that? And actually in the last lecture I talked about this verse in detail. Surprisingly enough, some people felt that this meant that a woman had to submit herself to the dictatorial commands of her husband from this verse, because it says if you fear rebellion on the part of your wives, husbands deal with it this way. And they felt the rebellion was a rebellion against your husband. But actually that's not what the Quran could possibly mean, because in verse 128 of the same surah it tells the wives in exactly the same words, and if a woman fears rebellion on the part of your husband, or that he may turn away from her, and then it says how she should deal with it. Among some of the things she could do, she might have to divorce him. But in any case, the Quran says that if a man fears rebellion on the part of his wife, and if a woman fears rebellion on the part of your husband, this is the way you deal with it. So it couldn't possibly be just rebellion against your spouse, or you'd have total chaos in the family relationship. The rebellion being referred to is obviously rebellion against God. And from the Prophet's sayings in this regard, it refers to if either spouse is potentially going to commit a serious criminal act. But notice it addresses both sexes here. Another interesting verse is in the Quran, the 9th chapter, verse 71. It says, and the believing men and the believing women, they are guardians of each other, guardians or protectors of each other. It's an interesting verse because pre-Islamic Arabian society, although women were somewhat liberated, was still very much a chivalristic society. And if you said to men that they were the guardians and protectors of women, I think they would accept this rather easily. But if you said to them that women were also their guardians and protectors, I think that would be difficult to swallow. It's even a little bit difficult to swallow today, even in Western society. We always think of the man as being the protector and guardian and not the woman. And it's very apparent just from watching movies and TV shows. But in this verse it tells men and women both that they are guardians and protectors of each other. Another interesting verse, this is the last one I'll cite in this regard, it says in the Quran, we have created you, O mankind, we have created you of a single spirit, and from it created its mate. And notice it doesn't say which is created first, or gets into the issue of who came first, who came last. This verse isolates a single topic, that both men and women are created from a single spirit, that they are spiritually equal, made of the same spiritual essence. It's beautiful because the Quran will often do this. It'll take away all those other issues that people sometimes get themselves into a long debate about, who came first, how did it happen exactly, and isolates the really important issue that men and women are spiritually equal. In their tendencies to do wrong, no differentiation is made between the sexes in the Quran. The Quran, in the well-known allegory of the first man and first woman, says that both were equally responsible for the first sin. When the Quran does address either sex singularly in the context of men's and women's roles, it's often to put an end to obviously unjust cultural practices that had existed in some Arabian communities, tribes. For example, female infanticide, the custom of ending marital relations with a wife and not allowing her to divorce, the practice of excluding female relatives from inheritance. These were practiced in some of the tribes in pre-Islamic Arabia, but these were ended. This practice was ended and stopped by the Quran. Although the Quran and sayings of Muhammad, may God bless him, did not exclude women from any career, it must be said that both of these sources do mention the importance of motherhood and the respect that society should give that position. Islam really does put a very strong stress on parenthood, and especially gives great admiration to the role of the mother in that regard. There are numerous sayings of the Prophet in this regard. Rather than just repeat them here, I'll tell you that they appear in a book that's easily obtainable from any Islamic center in your community. The book is The Status of Women in Islam by Jamal Badawi, Dr. Jamal Badawi, and you could look up many sayings of the Prophet in that regard. I'll isolate my attention on the Quran. In the Quran, chapter 46, verse 15, after telling men and women that they must surrender themselves to God and that He should be there's only one God, then goes on with the next command. It says, and we have commended unto mankind that he be kind to his parents. And which parent does it single out? This is invariably the way the Quran approaches this sort of issue. And we have commended unto mankind that he be kind to his parents. And which parent's role does it single out? For his mother bore him painfully, and painfully she gave birth to him. In the Quran 31:14, again, almost a verse of the same type, it says, "And we have enjoined upon mankind kindness towards his parents." And which parent does again single out for respect and admiration? And this is typical of the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet. It says in the very next verse, "For his mother bore him by bearing strain upon strain, and his utter dependence on her lasted 2 years. So be grateful towards me and towards your parents. And remember that with me, that is with God, is all journeys end." The interesting thing about these verses and the sayings of the Prophet is that it reminds mankind of his utter dependence on God by drawing a parallel to his utter dependence on his mother. Why is that striking? Well, and also I'd just like to say that the Prophet many times compared the love of God to mankind to the love of a mother for her little baby. It's interesting for those of us who grew up in Western societies in the Jewish Christian tradition, because invariably we always think of God's love as the love of a father for his creation. We think of it as the love of a father, a male figure rather than a female figure. And although in Islam God has no sex, he is transcendent, nothing can be compared to him from the Muslim standpoint, nonetheless, it's interesting that on many occasions the love of God for his creation was compared to the love of a woman, a love of a mother for her children. Many early scholars of Islam, based on the life example of the Prophet, felt that it was a husband's duty to supply his family with a housekeeper, if at all financially possible, and if not, to share in the housework and certainly the child care, in appreciation of the fact that raising children is an exhausting and extremely important job and should be shared by both parents. It's interesting that when one of the Prophet's wives, Aisha, was asked what was her husband's behavior, what was the Prophet's behavior in her house, she responded by saying he served his wife, and she meant that he did housework for her. She said that means he did housework at home. I wonder how many of us do that today. In the United States, my wife is often referred to incorrectly as Mrs. Lang. I say incorrectly because Muslim women do not take the name of their husbands, but keep their family names after marriage. Part of the reason for this is that Muslim women are to maintain their own economic identity and independence. As I already stated, Islam guarantees all men and women the right to own property and the right to own businesses, rights that were not extended to Western women until the last century. A verse from the Quran that very briefly describes the economics of the family is the following. It appears in the 4th surah or chapter, verse 34. It says, "Men are responsible for the full maintenance of women." Actually, it says men are to maintain women, but the verb is in an intensive form, linguists tell me. So it's best translated as men are responsible for the full maintenance of women. For God has given of his bounty more to one than the other. So they spend of their wealth on their families. I'll go back to the verse in a minute, but curiously, this verse has been used by Orientalists and surprisingly by some Muslims to argue that the Quran states that men are somehow innately superior to women. But this verse just summarizes a well-known Islamic arrangement, marriage arrangement. For in marriage, the entire responsibility for the economic needs of the family falls upon the husband. Any money his wife earns, any money his wife inherits or obtains as part of her marriage contract remains entirely hers, and she is not encouraged to share it with her family. I mean, she can if she so desires, but she's not encouraged to do it. She's encouraged to remain economically independent. While it is true that women will usually receive 1/2 the inheritance of her brother, for example, if my father dies and I was in a Muslim family, I would usually receive twice the inheritance of my sister. The man must share his portion of his inheritance with his wife, his family, and any needy near relatives, especially needy women relatives. So if one rereads this verse, it is obvious that there is no indication that one sex is superior to another. It's talking about family economics. Again, I'll just read it. It says, "Men are fully responsible for the maintenance of women, for God has given of his bounty more to one than the other," especially in this inheritance issue. So men spend of their wealth on their families. So they spend of their wealth on their families. Just to let you know for sure that this is referring to inheritance, maybe I should have begun with the 32nd verse. That says, "Don't envy the fact." It says, "Do not covet the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on some of you than on others." And then it goes on to tell you because, well, it's true that men inherit twice what women, it refers to inheritance relations, right? Inheritance arrangements right after that. In the very next verse, it tells you why people shouldn't covet the bounties that God has bestowed more than one on the other, because it says, because men are charged with the full care of their families, and women remain economically independent. The beauty of this verse, and I've always found this when I first went through the Quran, was it doesn't really state which one God has bestowed more bounties on one than the other. If you read the sequence, that in the balance of things, yes, God has bestowed some bounties more on men than on women, for example, inheritance. But on the other hand, since women have a much greater degree of economic independence, he has bestowed more bounties on women than on men. And many of the early companions of the Prophet used to protest that this verse favored women economically rather than men. But yet the Quran tells both sexes, at least as I understand it, that they should not feel jealous because one has certain advantages over the other. Because in the balance, as the Quran invariably does in the issues of men and women's relations and roles, it balances it all. It makes it all come out equal in the end. The purpose of this economic arrangement is to ensure that a married woman is not entirely dependent financially on her husband, and to truly balance the economic power in the relationship, and to protect the financial security of the wife in case of divorce or the death of her spouse or such matters. Islam emphasizes the unity of purpose in man's physical and spiritual lives. This is a consistent theme in this religion, and so it is not surprising that this faith encourages men and women both to involve themselves in the political life of the Muslim community. In the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in 1st century after his death, the nearest thing to voting for or endorsing a potential political leader of the Islamic State was a vote of confidence one would give to a potential candidate. And I say candidate in quotes because it's not a candidate in a Western sense of the term. They don't go around kissing babies and, well, it's just different. The Arabic word for this act is to give one's bayah. I have a difficult time pronouncing it. There's letters in there that I'm not accustomed to. But it's to give one's vote or vote of confidence or vote of allegiance. For example, when Muhammad died, the Muslim state had to determine his successor. At a community meeting to decide this, Omar, one of the Prophet's nearest companions, rose up and nominated another one of his nearest companions, Abu Bakr, with the words, "I give my vote of allegiance or my bayah to Abu Bakr." And then various members of the community did so in kind, giving their vote of allegiance to him, and some didn't. But he obtained the majority, and so he became the leader, the next leader of the Muslim state. This giving of a bayah, or oath of allegiance, was given by both men and women. When the Quran refers to this act of giving this vote, it refers to it in relation to women in the 60th Surah, 12th verse. In this verse, the Prophet is told to accept women's oath of allegiance as long as they satisfy, when they come into the community, as long as they satisfy certain minimal requirements. Muslim women were much involved in the political life of their community in the 1st century of Islam, and less so in the centuries after that. During certain times, they became more involved, and then in and out in this involvement. During the reign of Omar, there was a legislative body called the Committee to Tie and Untie. And this legislative body consisted of both men and women. During the reign of Uthman, there was some question as to his assignment of government posts, as to his assignment of people to government positions and posts. So he vowed that he would not appoint anyone new to office unless he first received approval from, among others, the Prophet's wives. So he wouldn't appoint anyone else to office unless he first received approval from some members of the community, and in particular the Prophet's wives. The brilliant Aisha, the Prophet's youngest wife, who is famous for her bold political endeavors, especially after the reign of Omar, she even led an army into battle, the famous Battle of the Camel. And although she later regretted fighting against Ali, she felt that she had made a mistake in that regard, she never regretted assuming a position of leadership. All Muslims are compelled by the Quran and by the Prophet's sayings to seek knowledge and learning. And throughout the history of Islam, women have certainly made their mark. One must again mention Aisha, the Prophet's wife and daughter of Abu Bakr, who is renowned for her knowledge of the sayings of Muhammad and was taken during her lifetime to be an expert on pre-Islamic Arabic poetry and an authority on medicine and on Islamic law. But in general, women did not, in the early years of Islam, play that great a part in the development of the natural sciences. But in the extremely important science of hadith, the sayings and history of Muhammad, from which much of Islamic law is derived, women played a very prominent role. The number of great women traditionists, as they were called, are too many for me to list here. Great women scholars in this regard. But their names could be found in many works on the, and the word in Arabic is Asma al-Rijal, which officially means names of the men, traditionists, but it includes in these works the names of women as well. And a good English reference for this is Hadith Literature by Dr. Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui. And both of these, well, let me just talk about this for a little while. These women scholars, and their numbers were many, took seats as students as well as teachers in public educational institutions, the large public educational institutions that were attended by both men and women, especially during the first 9 centuries of Islam. They attended general classes jointly with men traditionists, and in turn delivered lectures to large classes which were attended by men as well as women students in these large public educational institutions. The colophons of many manuscripts, which are still preserved in many libraries today, show them both as students and teachers of some of the most eminent male experts on this subject. Let me explain that last statement. What do I mean by the colophons? After, in those days, through the first many centuries of Islam, when you sufficiently learned or passed a subject being taught by a particular teacher, then he took your book, which covered that subject, and he signed not only his name to prove that you passed according to his standards, but he assigned his name, the name of his teacher, the name of his teacher's teacher, the name of his teacher's 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 teacher, all the way back perhaps into the very first generations of the Muslim community. And these colophons, these signatures exist today. And if you look at them today, you'll see among those names, you'll oftentimes see something like this: a name of a man, a name of a man, then a name of a woman, then a name of a man, then a name of a woman, then a woman, then a man, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that men and women played a very strong part in the development of this very essential science to the Muslim community, and that men and women were both teachers and students at these institutions. Well, what I have attempted to do today, I'm running out of time, is not so much to define Muslim female and male roles, because in fact I don't really feel that Islam does this so much, but I have tried to demonstrate that within the broad guidelines of this faith and the spirit of this revelation, there are infinite possibilities for the progress and development of the Muslim community. Certainly man's intellectual growth throughout the century has endorsed Islam. The fundamental rights that we've come to recognize that all men and women do and must possess, and even some we have not yet realized, were emphasized and insisted on 14 centuries ago in the revelation received and communicated by Prophet Muhammad. But we Muslims have in many ways lost the spirit of this message, and so we must fully commit ourselves to the future. We must offer our perspective and add our voices to the effort of solving the many problems that exist inside and outside our community today. This is an essential aspect of faith, and we have neglected it for too long. We have to strive towards the Quran's descriptions of those who truly surrender themselves to God. For it says in the Quran, "You are the best of people ever created for your fellow man. For you insist on that which is right, and you forbid that which is wrong." And why do you do that? You do that out of the highest moral standard, because you believe in one God. And thank you, Wahid.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now we are going to go and take a break for a couple of minutes, and we'll be back with your questions. So please, I urge you to prepare your questions and call in with those 2 numbers. Thank you.
Do we have a break now? Let's get a question from the studio audience.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا وآتوا اليتامى أموالهم ولا تتبدلوا الخبيث بالطيب ولا تأكلوا أموالهم إلى
Thank you. Well, now we'll be waiting for the phone calls, and as like I said, I urge you please to call in those numbers. And first of all, I will have a question for Dr. Lang. Doctor, as far as the woman's divorce situation and the man, can women divorce a man?
Oh, can women divorce a man? Well, just about every book on Islamic law states that women can divorce a man. The terminology for it is a little bit different than the terminology for when a man divorces a woman. I guess the Arabic word for it is khul or something like this. I have a difficult time pronouncing it. They often spell it phonetically as K-H-U-L, K-H-U-L, sort of like a khul. But in any case, it refers to the fact that women do have the right to divorce their husbands. In the lifetime of the Prophet, a woman came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and said to him, I'd like to divorce my husband, because I don't think I could stay within the bounds of this religion if I stay married to him. And his response was, well, has he done anything wrong? Is there in some way he's deficient as a husband? She said, no, he has excellent character, just that I don't love him. I don't feel that I can remain married to him and remain a good person, good Muslim. And he said, fine, then return to him the marriage gift that he had given you, and you are then divorced. And this is really the model that all jurists have followed. There's other traditions almost to the same effect that all jurists have followed up until now. And they agree that Muslim women do have the full right of divorce. The terrible thing is that in some Muslim communities around the world, this right is denied women, or extra qualifications. Very difficult and strenuous standards are imposed before they will allow a Muslim woman to get a divorce. Many Muslim people feel that a Muslim woman does not have the right to divorce unless her husband grants her that right, which means she doesn't have a right at all. But in fact, virtually all jurists, Muslim jurists, and it's very clear from the Quran that women have this right. As a matter of fact, the one verse I referred to, if women fear rebellion on the part of their husband, what should they do? One of the options she has is to divorce him. And there's another verse too in chapter 2 of the Quran, approximately 228, thereabouts. Again, it talks about how a woman could obtain her divorce. So it's very clear from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that this is a fundamental right of women, at least from my perspective.
And I guess I also understand that the divorce itself between a man and a woman, that there has to be some reason or a good cause to do so, right? I mean, it's not just because she's tired of him or something like that she has to...
Well, it depends. Certainly in Islam, the Prophet, peace be upon him, one time said, of all the things that God has permitted, the one that he hates the most is divorce. So Muslims are not encouraged to get a divorce, or to just, when things aren't working out so well, they get a divorce. Islam really has set many ways in which many procedures a person should go through before just jumping at a divorce. Try to go see marriage counseling, try to get family representatives to represent your view to his family's to a representative from his family. So every effort is made to try to keep the marriage together, especially for the sake of the children. Not so much for the sake of the adults, but for the sake of the children. But nonetheless, like I was saying, if a woman really, or a man, really feels that this marriage is not working out and that it's really destroying him or herself as a person, then they do have the right to divorce. So, you know, there has to be a compelling reason, but it could be a reason as simple as that.
I'm going to shift you a little bit, Doctor, on one of the most common questions being asked to Muslims, and especially the Muslims in Islam, which is when the Quran basically the idea of a man can marry 4 women which is a polygamy, I assume.
Yes, yes.
And what do you think of that? And what do you think this?
Well, we Muslims just like to have a good time. No, I'm joking. It's not that we just like to have a good time. I always begin by, the question he raised was the issue of polygamy, the marriage of more than one wife, the marriage of up to as many as 4 by a man. And strangely enough, as I read books about this issue, men's and women's roles, and I attended lectures by great speakers on this subject, I always, whenever a person in the audience raised this question, how can a Muslim man marry 4 women, the response is almost always something like this. Well, maybe the husband will get, maybe he can't satisfy himself with one wife, or maybe his wife will become sick and he needs to have a woman in his life, or his wife can't have children and he wants to have a child. Of course, these reasons aren't really that compelling, these explanations, because if you just switch the genders of the words you're using there, you get obvious counterexamples like, well, what if a woman can't get satisfied with one man, etc. This is not the issue that the Quran, this really shows you the power of the Quran over the thought processes of men and women, of human beings. Because when the Quran addresses this issue of the marriage of more than one wife, the Quran begins by not addressing the needs of men. It doesn't even address the needs of women. It begins by addressing the needs of children. It's an important point. The Muslim community had just suffered very severe losses in a battle. Their numbers were not that great to begin with. And after this battle, the number of men as compared to the number of women was extremely small. There were many widows and many orphan children that the Muslim state had to do something about. So this verse was revealed in this way. It said, and if you fear for the orphan, it doesn't say if you fear for the needs of men or women, if you fear for the orphan children, then marry, then it next mentions the needs of women, then marry from among their women, 2, 3, or 4, but if you feel that you will not be just, then marry only one. See. So the verse is not really concerned with the needs of men or women, it's concerned with the needs of children, and the potential for those children growing up without a father and without a family environment throughout the rest of their lives. It's also concerned secondarily with the needs of women, because there's going to be a huge number of women in situations like that are going to have to go for their entire lives without a husband or without a mate, and there doesn't seem to be any other conceivable solution to that problem. So Islam, the beauty of the Quran is this, especially and it does this in many places, but not just this. It takes an institution that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia that actually had very many bad sides. The issue of multiple marriages like this, multiple wives. It takes that institution, and rather than obliterate it entirely, redirects it, keeps the institution, but redirects it to a good end. How to deal with the needs of women, widows, and orphan children in a situation where there are few men to marry from among them. And the Quran, in its typical fashion, and this is true of many other aspects of Islam, it takes a pre-Islamic Arabian institution that was actually sometimes evil and turns it into something that is really quite good. It should also be noted, too, that no other scripture, at least to my knowledge, forbids the marriage of more than one wife. If you take, for example, the Old Testament, Solomon had, what, 700 wives, 300 concubines. The New Testament, though Jesus is very hard on on divorce, I know of no statement where he prohibited a marriage of more than one wife. But the beauty of, like I said, of Islam is it deals with a very real problem that faces many societies. For example, Germany after World War II. Some people say Californian society today, where the number of eligible men as compared to the number of eligible women there's a great difference. And how to deal with the potential of all these people going without husbands, and more importantly, these children going without fathers. This is the way the Quran deals with it. And I can't think of any other conceivable solution.
Just quickly, and to follow up on that, is that is there any basis as far as in Judaism or Christianity? I think you mentioned something in here, but as far as this is happening before, that did happen in Christianity, and Jesus had really nothing said about it? Or?
Well, polygamy had existed in both Christian and Jewish communities for centuries, even after the time of Jesus, and little by little it came to be ruled out. Paul, in the gospel, not in the gospel, in the letters, said that it's actually better not to marry at all if you can avoid it. so people felt, for one reason or another, little by little, gradually, the marriage of one man and one wife came to be the rule. Even in Islam, one might argue that it's certainly preferable to marry just one wife, and it's also common sense that that's preferable. In the verse in the Quran that I just mentioned to you, it begins with a conditional statement. If you fear for the orphan, then do this, but make sure you are just. The very fact that the verse is so conditional and adds so many conditions to this, stipulates so many conditions in this regard, makes you know immediately that under normal circumstances, one man, one wife is perhaps the ideal. There's another verse in Surah Al-Nur that was revealed a few years after this one that tells both men and women in the community that they should marry the single in their community. And in the very next verse it says not to even let financial matters sway you from that. So under normal circumstances, the marriage of one man and one wife is, even from an Islamic standpoint, at least as I understand it, is certainly preferable. And nobody is dying to get widows and children underneath their roof. But the fact of the matter is that this is a way of dealing with an illness that a society, or a tragedy, or a pain that the society is suffering. And of course, at least from my standpoint, if you're not sick, then don't take the medicine. But if you are, use the cure. And this is how, it's not like a picnic for men. Many people think of it that way. But the way this verse was revealed, the men were told to take orphans. Maybe I'm going too long about this verse, but they were told to take orphans and widows underneath their roof and start providing for them. In actuality, in those days, men weren't jumping at that idea. Many of them tried to find their way out of that. And then shortly after that, a verse was, they felt, well, I can't truly love them all equally. And then the verse was revealed, well, you will never be truly just, no matter how much that is your heart's desire, but at least you must be equitable. So it told men that, although they would probably like to get out of this situation, they really can't. This was considered a burden for men, not a big pleasure thing. I went too long with that anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, let's go ahead and try